welcome to the Deep Dive Podcast. Today I want to introduce a topic that's quite personal to me, and by no means am I any expert, but I'm just trying to draw from my experience being ADHD, and so I was diagnosed with ADHD at age 8 when I was a elementary school kid, and wouldn't pay attention, wouldn't sit still, just all the typical stuff that you go through as someone who's a child with ADHD. And I saw a child psychologist, and have to say I'm quite privileged to have that chance to talk with someone with that level of specialization, but at the time it kind of just felt like a game, and it was a very, very positive experience just being in this sort of environment where there's like a spotlight on you and you're just kind of like given some puzzles. But that, I didn't know at the time, but that really changed my life in many different ways. So diagnosed with ADHD, given sort of a regimen of sorts to try out all these different medications, and started this dialogue, this internal narrative of who I was as a ADHD person, which was independent of or not exactly tied to who I was as a human being. It was kind of just my brain being different and being sort of the the outlier of sorts in terms of just being different. But now where I'm 28, it's been 20 years since I was initially diagnosed. So now I'm looking back, and I'm really happy that I did get diagnosed, and I'm really happy that I had the opportunity to self-reflect, and holy shit, the changes are so slow. Like the changes from ages like maybe 18 to 28 is where I probably made most of my actual behavioral shifts that actually helped me function better as an ADHD student, adult, overall just person. And I just want to say that for those of you who don't understand what ADHD is like, or kind of like the sort of academic, context of it, it's kind of like there's all these different ways your brain just sort of operates and functions, and it's essentially these neurological differences. Try not to refer to them as deficits, but they're differences that, according to Gabor Mate, who's the sort of renowned trauma expert who also studied ADHD for a bit, they're these early childhood emotional needs that weren't being fully met or attuned to in a way that was consistent with how the child needed to be attended to. And even if the parent, for instance, understood this and maybe tried to kind of just BS their way through feeling really, really upset or triggered through some sort of trauma of their own, their nervous system would actually communicate more than the actual language or maybe the decision specifically. So there was an attunement of the nervous system that the adult would project onto the child, and through the child sort of picking up this cue that, I need to do something different. I need to be a little bit more receptive at times, or a little bit less attuned to my nervous system at times. This over time starts to become a pattern of sequential changes in the nervous system. And then this is the theory again. There's a lot of different theories, but this was the theory that tied it back to the childhood attunement relationships. So as you progress, your nervous system develops more, and it definitely changes. It definitely, over time, you grow into different sort of versions of ADHD, I would say. But some of that sort of, prime sort of ingraining that was being done at that sort of really key developmental phase of your childhood, that usually sticks around and probably won't go away for most of your life, or if any part of your life. But It's interesting when you start to kind of just accept it. As a child, I didn't accept it. I really felt very, I very much identified with the role of being ADHD. I have this like story when I was a kid where I like told a lifeguard, she was like asking if I had any health conditions. I was like, I'm ADHD, if that, means anything to you. And like, the degree to which I really identified with that role, in like elementary school, middle school, high school, even in like my first year of college or so, I think there was a degree to which I had to sort of start to revisit that self-stigma. And that self-stigma really goes a long way because it turns into self-judgment. And that self-judgment can really start to have its hooks in you unless you start to really take a step back and recognize that you are probably being unnecessarily critical on your ADHD symptoms and differences. But, it's hard to explain what it's like when you're walking into a room and you're like searching for a few things, and realistically you just stop. Like there's just a moment of blankness. And it's not just about the fact that you stop thinking about something and it just goes away. It's sort of like you're putting so much pressure on thinking in the way that's sort of like linear and maybe sort of likened to the typical non-ADHD mind, that you kind of just push it out of existence on some weird level. Whereas I've found that there's an interesting level of dependency on intuition. So I'm not saying that a ADHD person is even more intuitive than another person, but if they can teach themselves to listen more to that intuition, say in this moment, or where they're just like, oh, well, it's gone. There's kind of like a feeling, sort of a reaching back into the initial intuitive, I guess, sense that motivated that whole sort of, sequence. And it doesn't quite have to rely on the level of the nervous system. It can just like really, you can sense the initial intuitive motivation. So I find that's an interesting way to sort of, on some level, bypass the necessity for the nervous system to, jog the memory. Where, just my thoughts, it's not really about the memory at all. It's not really about the action of the nervous system being interrupted, so you can just sort of like continue that path. You don't need to continue that path. You need to kind of like actually reach back into something else. So I would propose the nervous system is communicating through intuition, or it's initially being motivated through intuition. And another thing that's really interesting to think about is how ADHD productivity is it's not really perceived or can be perceived the same way. So I like this metaphor I came up with, that where you're reading 5 books, right, all at the same time. You're sort of cycling between them, and someone's going to look at you and be like, hey, you've been reading, nice, which books have you read? So they're going to sort of gauge whether or not you've been reading a book start to finish. And there's automatically this level of like self-judgment. You're like, oh man, I can't even finish a book. But if you're realistically reading 5 different books, it's going to take you 5 times as long to get to the end, but you're still not actually sacrificing any level of quote unquote productivity. You're still getting through the book, you're still understanding the information, you're still connecting with material. And if you only judge yourself based on your ability to get from the start to the finish, not the experience, you're just going to basically just put down your books altogether, because you'll be like, I couldn't even finish a book. Where maybe give it some time, you'll finish all 5 books and you'll feel like you still got to the end result. It's just different. The path was different. And that, I guess, you also have to sort of apply that to other things. So this is where I think some people have challenges in sort of reaching deadlines and all that, but you can look at how you motivate yourself being not really necessarily related to this conventional reward model, whereas like maybe there's a different way to which you decide, like you're not going to be pushing that deadline. Hopefully you can still reach your, like, you know, you're running an assignment, you can still reach it, but there's a different way to which you motivate yourself that maybe isn't related to dopamine, maybe isn't related to even getting a good grade, completing the assignment. Like there's a different sort of process, a certain different type of convincing that you can apply that will just kind of feel more natural and take off that edge that might be, again, just equating it to there being a reward at the end, or there being some degree of normalcy to completing something on time. So sort of disconnecting on some level from the perception of what you ought to be doing versus how you just naturally feel you can flow through a process. And just wanted to kind of also maybe just throw out some interesting tools that I've found over the years as I started to sort of make changes in my life, were actually just naturally complementing or just stabilizing my ADHD. So that would be removing anything that dramatically plays with the dopamine or serotonin system, and also might impact the regulation. So like this could be drugs, either recreational or pharmaceutical. This could be just certain dietary changes or supplements. But that also kind of stems into like the second point being, try to like limit sugar or caffeine, because these are actually stimulants. So as an ADHD person, you can actually medicate using stimulants. They'll recommend using stimulants because it's meant to combat the inattentiveness and sort of like get the firing that maybe it's a little slow, kind of streamlined. So getting to that some other point, how medications may or may not work for certain people, or didn't really work for me in my case. But just with the sugar and the caffeine, you're kind of like overstimulating what might not need to be consistently stimulated. And so just be mindful of how that might interact with your ability to show up over the long term. If you are getting to a habit that has a lot of sugar and caffeine, just be mindful if you take a medication, there might be like a degree to which you might want to reduce those other two things. But then there's also this like psychological shift where you want to introduce mindfulness to how you've been feeling day by day, week by week, month by month, because these are what are going to teach you about what your ADHD mind naturally needs, which is going to be different, right? Like as you're making these changes, it's going to respond to that, and you're going to want to see if you can pick up your own little tips just by sort of noticing these behavioral shifts, and over time as those patterns develop. So, but like being patient, I think there's a lot of people that maybe they've been diagnosed as an adult and they just sort of want to jump into some sort of quick fix, which honestly, depending on the level of severity, I think is really important to embrace. Like, I don't want to say don't use certain quick fixes, but you need to also just understand that there's a level of patience and being really curious about like what's happening in your own mind, in your own body, because you can really just like help repair that self-stigmatization that might not be as severe if you're like an adult and you just jumped into it, but it's still gonna be there. Like, you know, you're still gonna think about it like, I'm different, I guess I'm quote unquote broken. So then there's this point where reaching radical self-acceptance with, you know, being ADHD and having that role or that identity is really, really key. So, you know, being proud of it, or finding the way to reach that point of where you can be proud of yourself just for showing up as you are. And over time, as you start to understand the condition, you can actually show up in a lot of different ways that are unique to being ADHD, and that actually will help you reach that point of radical self-acceptance. But just understanding that there's going to be days where you don't want to just like accept how your mind's operating, but like it's part of it. And then that also could look like seeking assistance, whether it be through some sort of like assistance program through a school, whether it be just slowing down. So like there's this interesting connection between self-care and mental health, but I find it's especially sensitive when it comes to ADHD people. So if you're able to stay on top of your self-care, it will allow you to have more of an awareness for those subtle little shifts that you're trying to kind of start to notice and maybe regulate. And it'll just give you that one-up. It'll give you that ability to sort of just notice how the nervous system is naturally changing. And this could be also accented through breath work, types of breath work that help you understand the nervous system a little better, or it teaches you in all these sort of, non-cognitive ways. So the body is sort of kind of teaching you more so. And then there's this, I really can't advocate for psychedelics enough, but at the same time, mindfully used and well integrated within your understanding of self, you can actually use these as a tool to help sort of fine-tune how your ADHD mind communicates with your nervous system. And you can sort of start to understand the nuances of how to co-regulate it through long-term, sustained, intentional psychedelic use. So like, you can't just use a lot of acid, have like a heroic dose of mushrooms or something, and then expect that you will start to understand how to allow your nervous system to sort of, like communicate through the lens of the ADHD mind. It's like you're going to need to be patient, but I think this is where microdosing can be helpful. This is where someone who is just starting to kind of make some of those behavioral changes and then microdose, there could be some synergy there. I can't necessarily say indefinitely depending on the person, but I think that that's something that I would recommend giving a go or being open to. And I also think it's just the last thing I want to address that's important is being open to using medication as a pathway or a stepping stone to reaching that sort of equilibrium or nuanced understanding of your nervous system, but not having it be the fix-all, because you're introducing another dimension to the fog, so to speak. So you're attempting to sort of find clarity within how your brain is communicating, because you're just communicating differently. It's just finding out about the most efficient or effective way to work with that style of communication versus fight it. And you are introducing something that will add another dimension to that. So, I mean, by that logic, you could use a medication and still understand your nervous system in a way that works with that and maybe like accommodate it. But if you're trying to do the one and you're introducing the other, it might increase that sort of learning curve, and you might find yourself becoming reliant on the medication or dependent on it, so that you aren't actually seeking those changes as much. And that'll very likely sacrifice the sustainability of your path of becoming the fully integrated ADHD mind. So, this is what's worked for me, and I'm by no means done with that path. I'm going to be working at this for the rest of my life, and I'm finding more advanced ways of making use of the ADHD mindset. But I do also just want to really emphasize that if I haven't already, if you can find a really good expert, like could be a coach, could be a psychologist, could be a psychiatrist, someone who specializes in that field, specializes working with people with ADHD, has the experience, has the know-how, maybe is ADHD themselves, maybe a combination of those things. I would wholeheartedly recommend trying to access that type of help if you can, if you can get it, if it's accessible for you. Because relying on that level of expertise really blows my personal advice out of the water. Who's to say you can't also just sort of apply both? But I think having that assistance, if you can find it, yeah, just listen to them, listen to their advice. If they really care, if they really have put in the work. I personally couldn't find that other than the one guy who diagnosed me. I couldn't see him actively and rely on that support on a day-by-day or even year-by-year basis. But if you can find that, lean into that. And that's that being okay with having support. And as an ADHD person, I kind of wish I had that. I kind of wish I had that person to help sort of just subtly point me in the right direction and support me while I'm going through the process of making these subtle shifts that are helping my nervous system flow in a more sort of, I guess, organic way. And yeah, that's all I really have to say about that. I just wanted to kind of share my experience and just reflect a bit on some of the conclusions I've made about my sort of journey with being ADHD, and yeah, be well.